For most of the 20th century, America ran on a promise so powerful that millions crossed oceans to chase it, and generations built their entire lives around it. The promise was simple, almost sacred. If you worked hard, played by the rules, and stayed patient, life would move forward. Not perfectly, not easily, but forward. You might not be rich, but you would be secure. You might not be powerful, but you would be protected. You would not fall forever. That was the American deal. It was never written into law as a single document. It wasn't signed by presidents or ratified by Congress. It lived instead in expectations passed quietly from parents to children, from teachers to students, from employers to workers. You show up, you contribute, the system meets you halfway. For decades, it largely did. A factory job could raise a family. A single income could buy a home. A medical emergency was terrifying but survivable. Old age meant rest, not panic. Failure was painful but temporary. There was a floor beneath people, a sense that no matter how hard life hit, there were limits to how far you could fall. That floor is what made America feel different. Not kinder, not fairer, but safer. Today, that floor is cracking. And for many Americans, it's already gone. Across the country, people are doing what they were told to do, working longer hours, delaying rest, cutting joy out of their lives, yet feeling more exposed than ever. The math no longer works. The effort no longer guarantees progress. The promise no longer holds. This documentary is not about nostalgia. It's not about blaming one generation or one political party. It's about understanding how a deal that once felt unbreakable quietly unraveled, and why so many Americans feel like they're rerunning faster just to stay in the same place. To understand the end of the American deal, we first need to understand what it actually was. The original deal wasn't about wealth, it was about stability. In the decades following World War II, America built an economic system designed around predictability. Jobs weren't just sources of income, they were anchors. Employment often came with healthcare, pensions, and long-term security. Wages rose alongside productivity. Housing was treated as shelter first and investment second. Education, while imperfect, was still within reach for ordinary families. Most importantly, risk was shared. When things went wrong, illness, layoffs, old age, the burden didn't fall entirely on the individual. Employers, unions, government programs, and communities absorbed part of the shock. The system acknowledged a basic truth. People are not machines. They get sick, they age, they fail. And a society that punishes those realities eventually punishes itself. This wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. The American deal worked because it aligned personal effort with collective support. Hard work mattered, but it wasn't the only thing holding people up. The system provided guardrails. Over time, those guardrails began to weaken. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. Beginning in the late 20th century, America started to redefine success and failure. Stability was rebranded as stagnation. Protection was reframed as dependency. Risk was no longer something to be managed collectively, but something individuals were expected to absorb alone. The deal began to change its terms. Jobs became flexible, a word that sounded liberating, but often meant disposable. Benefits were separated from employment. Pensions turned into personal responsibility. Healthcare costs shifted onto households. Education became an individual investment rather than a public good. Housing transformed into a financial asset before it was a place to live. Each change, on its own, seemed manageable, even rational. Together, they rewrote the contract. The New Deal said this: "You're on your own, but if you fail, it's your fault." This shift didn't just alter economics, it reshaped psychology. Americans were taught to internalize systemic failures as personal shortcomings. If you struggled, you hadn't hustled hard enough. If you fell behind, you had made bad choices. Structural instability was masked by motivational language. Insecurity was framed as a mindset problem. And yet, despite working more hours than many of their global peers, Americans today report higher stress, lower confidence in the future, and deeper anxiety about basic survival. This isn't because people suddenly became weaker. It's because the deal they built their lives around no longer exists. You can see it in how people talk about the future. Retirement is no longer a milestone, it's a question mark. Healthcare is no longer peace of mind, it's a calculation. Education is no longer a ladder, it's a gamble. Even full-time work no longer guarantees safety. The most unsettling part isn't that the American deal ended. It's that it ended without announcement. No one stood at a podium and said, "This system no longer works the way it used to." No public reckoning, no national conversation. The expectations remained, but the support slowly disappeared. People kept playing by rules that had quietly changed. That's why the frustration feels so personal. People don't feel betrayed by an abstract system. They feel betrayed by a promise they were told to trust. This betrayal doesn't hit everyone equally. It cuts deepest among those who believed the most. The people who delayed gratification, stayed loyal, followed instructions. The teachers, the caregivers, the workers who didn't chase shortcuts. The people who believed stability was earned through patience. They did everything right and still feel exposed. This is the emotional core of the end of the American deal. It's not just about money, it's about trust. When a society breaks trust with its people, the damage goes beyond balance sheets. It seeps into relationships, mental health, politics, and identity. People stop planning long-term. They stop believing in institutions. They retreat into survival mode. And survival mode is not a place where societies thrive. The shift of risk, the end of the American deal, did not begin with collapse. It began with a subtle transfer, a slow, almost invisible movement of risk from institutions to individuals. What once was shared quietly became personal. What once was buffered became exposed. And most Americans did not notice the shift until it was already complete. For much of the 20th century, American life was built around the idea that large systems absorbed large shocks. Employers carried responsibility for long-term stability. Governments played a role in smoothing economic cycles. Communities, unions, and public institutions acted as shock absorbers when things went wrong. This didn't eliminate hardship, but it limited how far hardship could spread. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, that philosophy began to change. Risk was reframed, not as something dangerous, but as something efficient. Companies were told that long-term commitments made them sluggish. Lifetime employment was labeled outdated. Defined benefit pensions were called unsustainable. Stability itself became suspect. Flexibility, speed, and cost-cutting replaced durability as markers of success. From a balance sheet perspective, these shifts looked rational. From a human perspective, they were transformative. when pensions disappeared and were replaced with individual retirement accounts, the risk of market volatility moved from corporations to workers. When healthcare became untethered from job security or heavily cost-shifted onto employees, illness became a financial threat. When wages stopped rising in line with productivity, families were forced to compensate by borrowing, working longer hours, or delaying basic life milestones. None of these changes came with a warning label. The language used to justify them was optimistic. Workers were told they were gaining freedom. Consumers were told competition would lower costs. Citizens were told efficiency would lead to growth that benefited everyone. But what actually happened was quieter and more personal. The system stopped guaranteeing outcomes and started offering chances. A job was no longer a path, it was an opportunity. Retirement was no longer an expectation, it was a goal. Healthcare was no longer a right tied to participation, it was a product. Education was no longer a bridge, it was a bet. If you succeeded, the system took credit. If you failed, the responsibility was yours alone. This reframing changed how Americans understood themselves. Economic insecurity was no longer treated as a structural issue. It became a moral one. Struggle was interpreted as poor planning, exhaustion as lack of discipline, falling behind as a failure of character. This mindset spread far beyond economics. It reshaped culture. Work became identity. Productivity became virtue. Rest became laziness. Asking for help became weakness. Americans didn't just lose protections, they lost permission to acknowledge vulnerability. And yet, beneath the motivational slogans, the reality was growing harsher. By the early 2000s, households were absorbing risks once carried by institutions. Medical bills became one of the leading causes of financial distress. Job loss became catastrophic rather than temporary. Economic downturns, once softened by stronger labor protections, now hit families directly and unevenly. The financial crisis of 2008 exposed this shift more clearly than any academic paper ever could. Millions of Americans discovered that the risks they thought were shared were, in fact, theirs alone. Jobs vanished, home values collapsed, retirement accounts evaporated. Meanwhile, the institutions that had encouraged risk-taking were often shielded from the worst consequences. The message was unmistakable, even if it was never stated outright. Some risks are systemic, but only some people are allowed to be protected from them. In the years that followed, the system didn't fundamentally change, it adapted. Temporary work became permanent, gig labor expanded, contracting replaced careers. Benefits were reclassified as perks rather than obligations. Economic volatility became normalized, not as a problem to solve, but as a condition to endure. Americans were told to diversify themselves the way portfolios are diversified. Learn new skills, build side hustles, monetize passions, stay adaptable. What this really meant was simple. Stability was no longer guaranteed by design. It had to be individually manufactured, often at great emotional cost. This constant adaptation extracted a toll that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. People stopped feeling anchored. Long-term planning felt risky. Families delayed children, homeownership, and retirement, not out of preference, but out of fear. The American deal once promised that effort led somewhere predictable. The new reality offers motion without direction. And perhaps the most destabilizing consequence of this shift is not financial, it is psychological. When risk becomes personal, failure feels intimate. When systems fail quietly, individuals blame themselves loudly. People begin to ask, what did I do wrong? Why can't I get ahead? Why does it feel like everyone else is managing except me? But the truth is this: most Americans didn't suddenly become bad at life. The system simply stopped doing its part. In the next part, we will examine how this transfer of risk reshaped everyday American life, not in headlines or stock markets, but in kitchens, workplaces, hospitals, and retirement plans. We'll explore how the erosion of the deal shows up in stress, delay, and quiet resignation, and why so many people feel like they're surviving rather than living. Because the end of the American deal didn't arrive with a crash. It arrived as a feeling, a constant, low-grade sense that no matter how hard you work, nothing feels secure anymore. The end of the American deal is not most visible in statistics or headlines. It lives in routine moments, in kitchens before sunrise, in cars during long commutes, in quiet anxiety felt on Sunday nights. It is woven into daily decisions Americans make not because they want to, but because they have learned they must. For much of the 20th century, everyday life carried a sense of forward motion. Progress did not feel guaranteed, but it felt plausible. A job was more than a paycheck. It was a foothold. A home was not just shelter, it was security. Healthcare was a safety net, not a gamble. Retirement was distant, but imaginable. Today, those assumptions have dissolved. Work no longer structures life, it consumes it. The modern American worker is expected to be constantly available, endlessly adaptable, and emotionally resilient in environments that offer little stability in return. Job descriptions change faster than skills can be mastered. Performance metrics multiply. Burnout is treated as a personal flaw rather than an organizational outcome. Even professional roles that once promised prestige and security now feel fragile. Teachers, nurses, journalists, engineers, many report the same feeling, working harder than ever while feeling less secure than before. The effort-reward relationship has weakened, and people sense it intuitively. This instability reshapes behavior. People stay in jobs they dislike because leaving feels dangerous. They tolerate conditions they would once have challenged because alternatives seem worse. Mobility, once a sign of opportunity, now feels like a risk calculation. Housing tells a similar story. Homeownership was once the clearest symbol of the American deal fulfilled. It represented permanence in a world of change. Today, housing has become one of the primary sources of insecurity. Rising costs, volatile markets, and limited supply have turned shelter into a financial stressor. Renters face annual uncertainty, knowing that renewal may come with a sudden increase or an eviction notice, masked as market adjustment. Owners carry the weight of debt, maintenance, and taxes that rise faster than wages. The home, once a stabilizing force, has become another variable. Healthcare adds another layer. Medical decisions are no longer made solely on the basis of need. They are filtered through cost, coverage, deductibles, and fear. Americans delay care, ration medication, and avoid treatment not because they don't value health, but because illness now threatens financial survival. This constant calculation erodes trust, not just in systems, but in the future. Retirement, once the reward at the end of a long road, has become abstract. For many Americans, especially those under 50, retirement is no longer a timeline, but a question mark. Savings feel inadequate. Markets feel unpredictable. Social insurance feels uncertain. As a result, people plan shorter lives, not shorter in years, but in vision. 5-year plans replace lifelong ones. Commitments shrink. Dreams become conditional. This shift affects relationships. Marriage is delayed. Children are postponed or foregone entirely. Care for aging parents becomes a logistical and financial puzzle rather than a shared societal responsibility. Families absorb shocks that institutions no longer buffer. And beneath it all lies a persistent emotional current, exhaustion, not just physical tiredness, but decision fatigue. The fatigue of always optimizing, always comparing, always adjusting. The fatigue of knowing that one mistake, one illness, one layoff, one emergency could unravel years of effort. This exhaustion changes how people see themselves. Instead of citizens with rights, many Americans now feel like customers navigating hostile terms of service. Instead of participants in a shared project, they feel like solo operators competing in a rigged environment. Trust in employers, in institutions, in the social contract erodes quietly. Cynicism replaces optimism. Survival replaces aspiration. And yet, what makes this moment especially painful is that the promise still exists rhetorically. The language of opportunity hasn't disappeared. It's everywhere, in political speeches, corporate messaging, and cultural narratives. You can still make it, Americans are told. You just have to work harder, hustle smarter, sacrifice more. But when effort no longer reliably leads to stability, that message becomes corrosive. People internalize failure that is not theirs. They feel shame for outcomes shaped by forces beyond their control. And over time, that shame turns inward into anxiety, anger, or quiet withdrawal. The American deal didn't just promise economic outcomes. It promised dignity, the sense that playing by the rules would earn you a life that felt secure and respected. Its erosion leaves something deeper than financial stress. It leaves a feeling of betrayal that many struggle to name. In the next part, we will examine how this quiet breakdown reshaped American identity itself, how politics, culture, and belief systems evolved as people tried to make sense of a world where the old guarantees no longer apply. Because when a deal collapses without acknowledgement, people don't just lose trust in institutions, they begin to lose trust in each other. When the promise breaks, politics follows. When an economic promise collapses quietly, the damage doesn't stay confined to paychecks or balance sheets. It spreads outward into identity, belief, and power. The end of the American deal did not just reshape how people live. It reshaped how they vote, how they argue, and how they see one another. For decades, politics in the United States functioned within an unspoken consensus. Parties disagreed on methods, but not on the premise that life would slowly improve for most people. Growth would lift standards. Institutions would endure. The future, while imperfect, would remain navigable. That assumption is now gone. As material security weakened, Americans began searching for explanations. But systemic failure is abstract, slow, and difficult to personalize. It does not point to a single villain. And in the absence of clear accountability, frustration looks for substitutes. Politics became the container for that frustration. The loss of the American deal fractured the electorate, not simply along ideological lines, but along emotional ones. Fear replaced optimism. Suspicion replaced trust. Grievance replaced solidarity. People who felt left behind didn't just feel economically displaced, they felt morally dismissed. Told that the system was working, they looked at their own lives and saw evidence to the contrary. That gap between narrative and reality became fertile ground for anger. This is where polarization accelerates. Economic stress rarely expresses itself directly. It disguises itself as cultural conflict. Anxiety about status becomes resentment toward others perceived as cutting in line. Declining opportunity turns into suspicion of institutions accused of favoritism or betrayal. Political identity becomes a form of psychological protection, a way to explain personal struggle through collective blame. And this dynamic feeds on itself. As trust in institutions erodes, people stop believing in neutral referees. Media becomes partisan. Expertise becomes suspect. Facts become negotiable. Every issue is framed as existential because, for many, life already feels precarious. This isn't accidental. When systems fail slowly, they create space for simple explanations to thrive. Complex economic forces, globalization, financialization, deregulation, automation are difficult to visualize, but enemies are easy to imagine. So politics shifts from problem-solving to storytelling. Different groups tell different stories about why the deal broke. Some blame elites, some blame immigrants, some blame corporations, some blame government itself. Often, these explanations overlap, contradictory, but emotionally satisfying. What matters is not accuracy, but coherence. In this environment, political leaders are rewarded less for solutions and more for recognition. Voters don't always want policy details. They want acknowledgement. They want someone to say, "You're not crazy. Something was taken from you." This is why political rhetoric has grown angrier, louder, and more absolutist. When people feel ignored, volume feels like power. But polarization comes at a cost. Its erosion leaves something deeper than financial stress. It leaves a feeling of betrayal that many struggle to name. In the next part, we will examine how this quiet breakdown reshaped American identity itself, how politics, culture, and belief systems evolved as people tried to make sense of a world where the old guarantees no longer apply. Because when a deal collapses without acknowledgement, people don't just lose trust in institutions, they begin to lose trust in each other. When the promise breaks, politics follows. When an economic promise collapses quietly, the damage doesn't stay confined to paychecks or balance sheets. It spreads outward into identity, belief, and power. The end of the American deal did not just reshape how people live, it reshaped how they vote, how they argue, and how they see one another. For decades, politics in the United States functioned within an unspoken consensus. Parties disagreed on methods, but not on the premise that life would slowly improve for most people. Growth would lift standards. Institutions would endure. The future, while imperfect, would remain navigable. That assumption is now gone. As material security weakened, Americans began searching for explanations. But systemic failure is abstract, slow, and difficult to personalize. It does not point to a single villain. And in the absence of clear accountability, frustration looks for substitutes. Politics became the container for that frustration. The loss of the American deal fractured the electorate, not simply along ideological lines, but along emotional ones. Fear replaced optimism. Suspicion replaced trust. Grievance replaced solidarity. People who felt left behind didn't just feel economically displaced, they felt morally dismissed. Told that the system was working, they looked at their own lives and saw evidence to the contrary. That gap between narrative and reality became fertile ground for anger. This is where polarization accelerates. Economic stress rarely expresses itself directly. It disguises itself as cultural conflict. Anxiety about status becomes resentment toward others perceived as cutting in line. Declining opportunity turns into suspicion of institutions accused of favoritism or betrayal. Political identity becomes a form of psychological protection, a way to explain personal struggle through collective blame. And this dynamic feeds on itself. As trust in institutions erodes, people stop believing in neutral referees. Media becomes partisan. Expertise becomes suspect. Facts become negotiable. Every issue is framed as existential because, for many, life already feels precarious. This isn't accidental. When systems fail slowly, they create space for simple explanations to thrive. Complex economic forces, globalization, financialization, deregulation, automation are difficult to visualize, but enemies are easy to imagine. So politics shifts from problem solving to storytelling. Different groups tell different stories about why the deal broke. Some blame elites, some blame immigrants, some blame corporations, some blame government itself. Often, these explanations overlap, contradictory, but emotionally satisfying. What matters is not accuracy, but coherence. In this environment, political leaders are rewarded less for solutions and more for recognition. Voters don't always want policy details. They want acknowledgement. They want someone to say, "You're not crazy. Something was taken from you." This is why political rhetoric has grown angrier, louder, and more absolutist. When people feel ignored, volume feels like power. But polarization comes at a cost. After the deal, what America owes itself, every generation inherits a story about how life is supposed to work. Not written into law, not sworn into office, but repeated so often it becomes truth. For much of the 20th century, America's story was simple. Work hard, follow the rules, and the future will take care of you. That story is now broken, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, over decades, through policies passed far from kitchen tables, through economic shifts explained in language most people were never invited to understand, through promises kept just long enough to feel permanent. The American deal did not collapse in one moment. It eroded. And erosion is dangerous precisely because it feels natural. Each loss seems manageable on its own. A smaller pension here, higher rent there, more debt, fewer benefits, longer hours, thinner margins. People adapt. They always do. Until adaptation becomes exhaustion. Today's America is not poor in aggregate. It is not short on innovation, productivity, or wealth. It is rich, extraordinarily rich, but it is a country where abundance no longer translates into security for most people. That is the defining contradiction. For the first time in modern American history, an entire generation is being asked to accept downward mobility as normal, to work more for less, to borrow for basics, to treat instability as maturity, to see precarity not as failure, but as character building. And this expectation is enforced quietly through markets, through algorithms, through credit scores, through policies framed as inevitabilities rather than choices. The end of the American deal was not the result of laziness, demographic change, or moral decline. It was the result of decisions repeated, reinforced, and defended that shifted risk away from institutions and onto individuals. Retirement was privatized, healthcare was commodified, housing was financialized, education was debt-financed, labor protections were weakened, growth was disconnected from wages. Each move made sense in isolation. Together, they rewrote the rules of life. And when the rules change without consent, trust disappears. This is why so many Americans feel angry without knowing exactly why. Why politics feels personal. Why every economic debate feels existential. Why optimism has given way to survival thinking. The American deal was not just an economic arrangement. It was a social contract, a shared belief that the system, while imperfect, was ultimately on your side. When that belief dies, society doesn't collapse overnight. It fragments. People retreat into identity, tribe, ideology, or nostalgia. They argue about symptoms, while the underlying structure remains untouched. They blame one another because blaming the system feels abstract, and because the system rarely speaks back. But here is the uncomfortable truth. No deal lasts forever. The original American deal was built for a specific moment in history, one shaped by post-war dominance, cheap energy, expanding manufacturing, and a global economy that favored the United States almost by default. That world no longer exists. What remains is a choice.